Imagine reaching a point in your life where your income is higher than it has ever been, your bank account is more stable than it used to be, and yet, when you pause and reflect, the feeling you expected never fully arrives, because instead of feeling rich, you feel almost the same as before, just operating at a slightly higher level of responsibility, slightly higher expenses, and slightly higher expectations. This experience is not unusual, and more importantly, it is not random. Because the feeling of being rich is not directly tied to how much you earn, but to how your brain measures progress, stability, and relative position within an invisible financial system that constantly shifts the definition of enough. At the core of this is a psychological mechanism known as adaptation, where your mind quickly normalizes any improvement in income or lifestyle, turning what once felt like progress into a new baseline. And once that baseline is established, your expectations quietly rise to match it, which means the emotional reward you anticipated begins to fade much faster than the financial change itself. To understand why this happens, it helps to look at the structure of your expenses. Because income does not exist in isolation, it interacts with lifestyle, and lifestyle tends to expand in proportion to income, not necessarily out of carelessness, but because higher income introduces new categories of spending that previously did not exist, such as better housing, more convenience, improved quality, and increased social alignment with others in a similar bracket. If you think about it mathematically, imagine your income increases by 50%, but your fixed and variable expenses rise by 40% over time. What remains is technically more than before, but the margin of safety, the psychological breathing room, does not expand at the same rate. And in many cases, it feels almost unchanged because the system you are operating within has scaled with you. There is also a relative component to this, because your brain does not evaluate wealth in absolute terms. It evaluates it in comparison to your environment, which means as your income grows, your reference group often changes as well, and instead of comparing yourself to where you started, you begin comparing yourself to those slightly ahead of you, resetting your perception of what counts as rich without you consciously deciding to do so. Historically, this pattern has repeated across different income levels and time periods, where individuals reaching higher earning brackets report similar levels of financial satisfaction as those below them, not because money has no impact, but because the system continuously adjusts both expectations and obligations in a way that keeps the subjective experience relatively stable. Another layer to this is the structure of modern financial systems, where many costs are designed to scale with income, whether through housing markets, social norms, or access to services, creating an environment where increases in earnings are partially absorbed by increases in cost, leaving the individual with improvement, but not transformation. This creates what can be described as a moving threshold, where the point at which you expect to feel secure or wealthy keeps shifting forward, and because that threshold is not fixed, it becomes difficult to ever reach a moment where you clearly recognize that you have crossed it. Over time, this leads to a subtle but persistent disconnect, where objective financial progress exists, but the internal signal that confirms it remains weak, causing people to chase higher income not only for practical reasons, but in an attempt to reach a feeling that the system itself makes difficult to sustain. What changes this is not necessarily earning more, but changing the way progress is measured, because as long as the measurement is tied to relative comparison and expanding lifestyle, the outcome remains unstable, whereas when progress is tied to more fixed metrics, such as the ratio between income and obligations, or the amount of time your existing resources can sustain your current life without additional input, the perception begins to shift in a more grounded way. This is where the concept of financial thresholds becomes more useful than raw income numbers, because thresholds define positions within a system rather than absolute amounts, and once you begin to see your finances in terms of thresholds, you start to recognize that feeling rich is less about how much flows in, and more about how much control, margin, and stability exist within the structure you have built. In the end, the reason you never quite feel rich is not because you are doing something wrong, but because the system you are operating in continuously adjusts both the target and the measurement, and unless those measurements are consciously redefined, the feeling you are aiming for remains just slightly out of reach, no matter how much the numbers change.